Welcome to the Insurgency with me, Steve Baker. In a moment, I'll introduce my guest. I'm really delighted to be joined by Tom Harwood. But before I do, we both wanted to acknowledge that this is the week in which Charlie Kirk was murdered. It's an absolute outrage. He was using his right of free speech to advance what he believed was true and right. And for that, he was murdered. And we grieve for Charlie and we grieve for his family. Tom.
It's just so terribly sad to see when particularly a political assassination like this takes place. And I don't think we need to mince our words. This was clearly a political assassination. I think we should really worry about the state of discourse, the sort of silos that people find themselves in, the inability to understand or even see people who think differently as human. That's where perhaps this has got to, and that is a deeply troubling situation. I am so sorry for his wife, his two kids. Really, really tough times. But I just hope that this doesn't spiral further.
100% agreed. And, Charlie and your family, we're absolutely thinking of you. We'll be right back in a moment. So this is The Insurgency with me, Steve Baker. It's the podcast that helps you get behind the news and really understand what's going on and why in the public debate and why politicians so often fail us and how we can do better. So I'm really delighted today to be introducing a young journalist who I've really admired for a long time, and he's already reminded me of some stories I'd forgotten. It's Tom Harwood. He's a rising star of British journalism. He's tormented us at Guido Fawkes. He's now the deputy political editor at GB News, and he's done much else besides. Tom, I want you to tell us all about it. Welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here.
Now, before we go any further, you're going to tell us everything, but I want to hear about the Death Star.
The Death Star. This is back at university where I cut my teeth on the pernicious world of student politics, where things are quite so vicious because the stakes are so low. And I think this is something that has been really quite peculiar across various universities. I'm strongly of the opinion that the archetype of the hyper left-wing student doesn't really exist. There's a tiny percentage of very political people on probably both sides of the spectrum at universities, but more so on the left. Yeah. But 90% of students couldn't give a fig about what goes on in student politics. And I found that the way to win a student election was to just be incredibly silly, was to make people laugh.
Yeah.
Throw an important point there at the end about the unrepresentative nature of most student delegates, but I was elected as an NUS delegate a couple of times when I was
and
at
a real
Durham.
Slam dunk, yeah.
I mean, turnout was up 600%, and all of those people voted for me.
Yeah.
And this was just through parody videos that were sort of because all of these student politicians, they think that they can solve world hunger, they think that they can stop wars, they do motions on things that have nothing to do with students. One of the NUS conferences I went to was stopped because something about abortion in Ireland was going on at the time, and so people protested and got up onto stage, as if the NUS conference has anything to do with that. Yeah. And so my pledges, build a fully functional Death Star, raise a statue to the then NUS president, Malia Bouattia, I think begin every lecture with a pledge of allegiance to the NUS, all of these different things. And of course, defeat ISIS, which at the time was a growing political insurgency, with NUS boycotts. That was one of the other slogans and pledges that saw the sort of comedy video.
So why did no one follow your example? I've got to ask you, why did nobody follow your example and go, it's obviously brilliant campaigning, a serious point, well made. It obviously enjoyed the consent of your electorate. They turned out in big numbers for you. Why didn't it catch on?
I don't know. I think it was probably a lot of effort to do. I mean, to produce a video like that, it took a lot of time. I remember actually sitting at the back of one of my lectures, just sort of editing frame by frame some of these videos. Actually, one of these videos that came to the attention of a guy called Paul Staines, who used to run the Guido Fawkes website. Yeah. So I appeared sort of on Guido Fawkes. Well, that video got shared. It's one of the reasons I then got hired as a reporter for Guido. Yeah. And that kicking off that entire sort of process. Yeah. But it also caught the eye of some people at the BBC and the Sunday Times, and sort of so it got quite a bit of media coverage. But I think one of the things about it was that it actually took a lot of effort to do. You know, you had to plan it, film it, edit it, put it out there. It's not just about the ideas, it's about the execution.
I think it comes back to the fact that just most students aren't interested. Most of them just aren't interested, and they don't have the time to be interested. I remember when I was at Cambridge and I was helping out with a few of the student body president campaigns, we were just trying to target sports people and saying, we'll get you guys more funding, we'll help with sports and things like that. And even then, we didn't get any interest at all, trying to actually appeal to the interest, because most students, they just want to do their degrees, they want to play for a sports team or be part of university society, and they don't want to have to take part in what they see as either the insanity or the boringness of student politics.
Yeah.
But that's also played out in real politics too. I mean, any local election is a game of turnout, not a game of persuasion. I mean, it's a bit different in a general election, but in a local by-election, for instance, when you're expecting turnouts of 20%, you're just trying to turn people out. You're not trying to convince or persuade. Yeah. So in student politics, where it's just everything is so silly, if you can make someone laugh, you're pretty much a slam dunk win.
Yeah, I'm terrifically encouraged that people turned out for you. Now, before you joined Guido Fawkes and started terrifying us all, you led Students for Britain, I think. Any recollections of anything important that might have happened during that period, Tom?
Well, Steve, we did have a little conversation before we started recording where I reminded you of a story that had been memory hold in your head, but was actually one of my first times speaking to a member of parliament. So this was back in the summer of 2015. The Conservatives had just won a surprise general election victory.
Yeah.
You'd started organising on the backbenches of the Conservative Party for the upcoming inevitable referendum and launched a group called Conservatives for Britain.
I did.
And I saw this launched in the Sunday papers. I think you might have been on one of the Sunday shows.
I was, yeah, Sky News,
And I thought, and I searched it online, and there wasn't any Facebook presence, there wasn't any Twitter presence. So I made a Facebook page and a Twitter page called Conservatives for Britain, sort of as a supportive thing, and tweeting out the articles, tweeting out support, and it got quite a large following quite quickly.
Yeah.
At which point, someone DM'd I think the Twitter account saying, "Sorry, who's running this?" And I was like, I'm just a sixth former. I mean, and so in the end, you ended up phoning me up because someone asked my number and saying, "Can I have the passwords,
Can I please take this over?"
But as a result of that, you introduced me to Matthew Elliott.
Yeah.
A guy called Stephen Parkinson as well.
Yeah.
I met the people at Business for Britain. I ended up then running Students for Britain with all sorts of various campaign materials that went down well at university campuses.
Tom, it all comes flooding back now, and I just want to say congratulations because you did two things. You did a brilliant job of that social media presence, and I remember now thinking this really is good. But you also absolutely terrified me when I realised I'd forgotten to secure the social media. That was a mistake I decided then never to do again.
Yeah, but I must say, I think every time you've set anything up, the first thing you've said to me is secure the social media
account. But it's so interesting because a lot of people are sort of, how do you get your foot in the door in this sort of world? And that was in many ways sort of the way in which I got my foot in the door.
Yeah.
Then talking to people, turning up, doing a bit of work experience, and ending up being offered running the student wing of this nascent organisation back in 2015, ready for 2016 when that referendum happened. Of course, we didn't know it would be in 2016 at that point. Could have been in 2017, could have been in 2018.
Yeah.
Tom, I don't know if you remember when we first met, but it was at an end of term Kuka dinner.
This is the Cambridge University Conservatives Association.
Yes. Sorry to say that. But you were in upper sixth, and I was in my first year.
I was the annoying sixth former who turned up.
Well, you were passionate about leave then. You were absolutely passionate. But one of the things I think would be absolutely interesting to know is how did you get so into campaigning so young? Because to be so brave as an 18-year-old, let alone to show up to a university end of term dinner. But also to do everything you've done, the social media account and all that. How did you get so passionate and so interested in campaigning from such a young age?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to think. I mean, I think one of the things that actually switched me onto this stuff was when Margaret Thatcher died in April 2013, if I remember rightly.
Yeah, sounds about right.
And I don't know, there were some Facebook groups at the time. I just sort of went in a deep dive in all of this stuff. The year before had been the American presidential election, and I'd followed a bit the Gary Johnson campaign. He was the Libertarian presidential candidate.
Gary Johnson.
He was a 2-term governor of New Mexico, where he was known as Governor Veto because he just stopped basically every bill. And anyway, I sort of, through him, I learned a bit about Hayek. I learned a bit about Milton Friedman, and I sort of went down this path. When Margaret Thatcher died, I sort of joined all these Facebook groups, got to know a few people, and then the following summer in 2014, I interned at the Institute of Economic Affairs, just for a few weeks in the summer. But then that was the first time I'd ever set foot in Parliament through a guy called Grant Tucker, who's now a big shot in the media, but then was the intern outreach person at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and just sort of through that, all that world opened up. But also I grew up in Cambridge. I was living there at the time. I turned up to an event that was supposed to be the Conservative Association for the city, but actually had become a KUKA event at some point over time. So I turned up to a black tie event in a jumper and trainers. And I was like, okay, either I can run away ashen-faced and embarrassed, or I can just embrace it and say hi to everyone. I did the latter.
Yeah, well done. So, you went on to Guido. How did that happen? You said Paul Staines noticed the videos you'd done.
That's right.
Yeah, but so how did you join Guido? Because I remember you were terrifying us because we'd seen the videos you'd done and I thought, oh, here comes trouble.
Yeah, well, actually, one video that I haven't mentioned yet is Votes at 12, which was a campaign that I remember. So this was after the referendum year. Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party. I think Emily Thornberry deputised for him at a Prime Minister's Questions and did all 6 questions on Votes at 16. Yeah. And I remember watching this and just thinking, what? That's your priority? The country's on its knees and that's your priority? And so I made a sort of joke website, Twitter account, campaign video, the usual formula. I had a T-shirt printed saying Votes at 12, using the same sort of
and if you'd like a Fighting for a Free Future T-shirt, do check the merchandise online.
Well, I think Votes at 12 is about to become Labour policy.
Well, it's clearly, but that again got me on the Sunday shows. People sort of noticed a bit in Westminster. And when I was graduating, I was thinking, what am I going to do? I wasn't sure sort of where I wanted to go. There was a job coming up at Guido because 2 brilliant journalists were leaving Guido at that time, Ross Kempsell and Alex Wickham. Ross, who is now in the House of Lords in his early 30s, amazingly, and Alex, who's now a big shot at Bloomberg. But at that time, Paul was hiring then, Paul Staines, and someone that I knew at the Adam Smith Institute, actually, Matt Kilcoyne, messaged me saying, Tom, have you thought about going for this? Because they wanted someone who was sort of into video. They wanted to sort of pivot to that sort of new media stuff. Guido's a very old blog in terms of the world of blogging. I mean, it was founded in 2004.
Yeah.
But they wanted to do more video stuff. And so I made a sort of audition video on the overspending of the Remain campaign, which is a massively unsung story. But absolutely, because everyone spoke about this bogus alleged stuff about Vote Leave. But I mean, factorially higher, the Remain campaign overspent once you include the government leaflet, once you include all this sort of stuff, and some of these arm's length campaigns that looked very coordinated. Anyway, ancient history now. But that was sort of the report that I did. They ended up running that. I got hired, and then boom, my first week was the Chequers week.
Oh wow! Yeah.
This is 2018. When I joined, Boris Johnson was still Foreign Secretary. David Davis was still Brexit Secretary. Week 2, they weren't. And suddenly you're in the deep end.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you've gone on to join GB News, but we're going to come back to that because I want to just touch on some of your policy positions, because you picked up on a Labour MP had lost the whip, accused by his own colleagues of persistent knobheadery.
That was the quote in the Times.
Yeah, so you use that as an article on Substack. It's a brilliant article. Just talk us through the knobheadery of public policy that you cover in this article.
Yeah, I thought it was a good phrase to sort of highlight the lack of bravery of politicians over the course of the last 25 years. I think in that article, because there are sort of two companion articles that go through why Britain is quite so broken on every fundamental level.
Yeah.
But sort of the interesting thing here is that in the 1990s, Britain was a net energy exporter. And energy prices were going down, not up. We just opened a link to the continent with a new rail line, high speed as it was, across under the channel. We just built a new nuclear power station. 1994 was when it opened. We had just built a new airport. That was 2001, runway in Manchester. The last motorway we built was, I think, in 2003, the M6 toll. All of these things, but that's the last time we did them, around the turn of the last century, and we haven't done them since.
Reservoirs, we're so overdue a reservoir.
1992. It is extraordinary to see that we sort of just decided around the turn of the century that we had developed as a country and didn't need to do anything else.
Yeah.
And what happens if you stand still as a country in a world where everyone's competing? You don't stand still, you fall behind. Yeah. So I think that's one of the things I point to in that article.
And you particularly pick up on planning, because I'm really seized that young people desperately need homes. When MPs are complaining about a lack of family formation, but how can they form a family if they can't get a home? And you particularly picked up on planning.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things is that even though the planning system has been broken since 1947, the real time that it seems to have pinched most perniciously is after 2010. And why is that? I mean, lots of reasons, but one of the reasons that I explore is, and it's not my original idea, I think it's probably from one of the Works in Progress guys that originally picked up on it.
Yeah.
But London was a city of 9 million people in the 1930s. Then you had a lot of people leave due to the Second World War. You had general decline of this country throughout the post-war years. The population of London starts growing again in the 1980s, and it reaches again that 9 million level around 2010. So if you think about sort of London having built out before that green belt was imposed around it, freezing the size of it, before it became much more difficult to redevelop, to build, to subdivide, to all those sort of things. London was built as a city for 9 million people before the Town and Country Planning Act 1947 came into place. People then left, people came back in, but it filled up again to that 9 million level around about 2010. Which then makes it harder to expand beyond that, because then you sort of reach the built-out expanse of where it was before the planning restrictions came into effect. Yeah. And because London is such an important driver of growth in this country, that then bites so much more. It's a small part of the puzzle, but I think it's a really interesting part of the puzzle.
Well, who knew that the planning of land use by the state would be a failure?
But it's so interesting. If you look at any city around this, I mean, if we had frozen the size of cities, as the sort of green belt policy determines to do, if we'd frozen the size of cities in 1776, let's say, to pick a random year, the year, of course, that The Wealth of Nations was published, as well as the American Revolution. If we'd have frozen the size of cities then, Manchester would barely exist. Birmingham would barely exist. There would be several cities simply wouldn't. Norwich would be one of our largest cities, as would York. But the thing about a changing and growing economy is that when new industries come along, different areas of the country are better suited for those industries. So whilst York and Norwich are still lovely cities, they are no longer the biggest cities in the country, because Manchester and Liverpool and Birmingham massively expanded during the Industrial Revolution.
Now look, I freely confess I'm an old guy now. You talked about 2004 as if it was a long time ago. But that's hardly any time for
you were still a Euro-federalist in 2004.
Yeah, I probably was. It's a confession. But, what do you think is the mood amongst people your own age, if I may say so, about housing? Is it one of despair, hopelessness?
It's just despair, isn't it? I mean, I speak to so many of my friends, whether they vote Labour, Lib Dem, Green, Tory, and they say they'll vote for any party that fixes the planning system and the housing crisis. They'll vote
Yeah.
for any party because they simply cannot have the security that comes with housing and take the next stage in their lives.
Yeah. It's a great point to pick up your transition, because you went from having a lot of campaigning experience, being a brilliantly successful campaigner, getting elected. You've obviously got a very, very close interest in public policy, what works, what doesn't work, why. But you decided to become a journalist, not seek election, not be working directly in public policy. Tell us why you made the leap into journalism. How did it feel to make the change? What does it mean to you?
For me, it was quite a natural and easy jump. The way that we at Guido described it was campaigning journalism. Journalism with a cause. Now, that cause was very often exposing skullduggery at Westminster.
Yeah.
And highlighting the ineptitude or perhaps inaptitude of elected members of Parliament, but also, we knew what we believed. We were honest about what we believed, and that's an ethos that I think followed through to GB News, which is a slightly different way of going about doing television broadcast news in the United Kingdom. I think we've had a very healthy broadsheet and tabloid journalism market in terms of the papers, and have done for centuries. But we haven't had that sort of diversity, competition and health in broadcast. I think that's been completely blown open by the internet, but that's taken a long time to sort of establish itself. And now we do have that sort of competition at a broadcast level as well. So I think it's been a sort of natural progression. And I think it's completely possible to align being a journalist and holding views yourself. The most important thing is honesty. Being open and honest about where you stand, and then you can have an open and honest conversation. The thing that I detest most about some journalism is when someone pretends to be impartial. You can clearly tell when where they're coming from, but they pretend to be holier than thou, as if they have no opinions at all, when actually you can tell with every single question they ask exactly where they're coming from.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. I mean, anyone who's been interviewed by Emily Mattis or, Beth Rigby or Kate Burley knows exactly what you're saying.
I can't possibly comment. But this is a really interesting point about GB News, because, I think the regulators occasionally have taken a view, but your GB News is proving extremely popular with the viewer, isn't it?
It's incredible. The last 2 months, we've been the #1 news station in the UK. And each month, sequentially, we've got higher and higher viewer shares of audience. And it's not just about... So what we've been established as for... I'd say at least a year now, is when there's not a particularly newsy day, people watch GB News. A lot of debate, a lot of discussion. It doesn't have to... Traditionally, what would happen is BBC and Sky would have a lot of viewers when there was a breaking news story, when there was a terror attack or a resignation or something big, But for the first time last week, when Angela Rayner resigned, GB News was the #1 news station then. That was bucking a trend that has... GB News has been around for 4 years now. But on last Friday... For the first time, I think that I can remember, on one of these big news days where a big event happens, the Deputy Prime Minister resigns in disgrace, people chose to watch GB News more than Sky or the BBC News Channel. Now, that is a really interesting shift, because it means that people aren't just watching GB News now for discussion on a sort of slow news day, but are watching it on a heavy news day too.
Yeah, well, that's great. So the thing I really want to get into is why journalism is the way it is. So can you tell us a bit about, because obviously I normally, this is my first time asking the questions of a journalist. It's a huge privilege, and it really is. But what are the incentives and pressures on the journalist to meet deadlines, to maybe sometimes, maybe not at GB News, but maybe for some journalists to take a particular editorial line? What are the pressures and incentives? What is it that enables a journalist to get on in their career?
I think you've got to seek out a story. And I don't think that that's a sinister motivation, but I think sometimes that can lead to trivialities and sort of skirting over policy.
Yeah.
Now, I think clever people in Downing Street have sometimes realised this, that if you dangle a ball in front of a bunch of journalists that has lots of catnip in it, to mix all sorts of metaphors.
Yeah.
They can chase after that, and actually government can get through pretty significant policy changes when the journalists aren't looking. And I think we've seen that in a number of different areas where sort of things that seem dull don't sort of get the attention. Massive changes can happen in terms of secondary legislation and primary. But ultimately, there is a practice that I think is damaging to the profession, that is sort of the gotcha, catch you out kind of journalism that can be very fruitful and get a lot of clicks. But it was most exemplified during the pandemic when it became known as the phenomenon of Scotch egging. Oh, yeah. I don't know if you know about the Scotch egging, but
I don't remember it being used as a verb. But the Scotch egg rule was one of the most ridiculous debates we've had in the country.
Substantial meal?
Well, this all emanated from one of these press conferences where a new rule was announced that you can have alcohol as long as it's alongside a substantial meal outdoors at a setting during one of these ridiculous stages of lockdown. I think it was locking up again rather than unlocking at that stage. And then the inevitable journalist question is, well, what's a substantial meal? And every single different item conceivable on a menu was asked, does this fit into that definition? Does that not? And sort of you're then trying to tease out something from the government spokesman that will make a good, front page for the Sun or an amusing headline. Is it actually the core of the issue? Is it the most serious point of policy? No. Yeah. But is it the best story? Yes.
Yeah. So now the public are going to be busy. We think that people will watch this podcast because they want to get inside why the conversation is really the way it is. And I think you've shared some really wise insights. But what can people do who want a better conversation? If people are watching this podcast and they're thinking, I'd like more from journalists, I'd like more from politicians, I'd like them to seriously engage with the reality that we can't afford the public services we've got and they're not good enough. What can members of the public do from the perspective of a journalist to try and improve the public conversation?
I think it's been one of the lessons of my career campaigning and in journalism is I'm sure lots and lots of people think something should be done. Oh, wouldn't it be good if? I mean, all of these different things. But the number of people who then actually get up and do that thing is so much smaller.
Yeah.
So whether or not that's, write into someone or start a campaign or, make a sort of effort in some way, whatever it is, going from thinking about something to doing something seems to be a step that maybe 95% of people do not take. And you'll find that when you step forward and sort of go out and do something, you can have a massively outsized impact. The thing is, the incentive structure seems to be set up so that people who want to stop things have a much greater incentive to go out and stop things. You're much more likely to want to stop something being built in your local community than argue for something to be built in your local community. You're much more likely to be able to galvanise people against some horrible piece of government legislation than in favour of a new bill. It seems that there is always an incentive structure that is set up against people who want a freer future. And so those people need to campaign all the harder.
But Tom Harwood, it's been an absolute joy to have you on. I am ready to vote for Tom as the UK's Javier Milei. I think that Harwoodism is the solution to this country's problems. And it's been a real joy to have you on. You're a real rising star of journalism. And I really want to thank you for honouring us by coming on for the first episode of this, The Insurgency, with me, Steve Baker. Tom, thanks very much indeed.
Thanks for having me.